If you enjoyed this audiobook, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Chapter 1. The Ground is Supposed to Move. Part 1. The old map doesn't fit the new territory. Think about the last time a plan you were proud of fell completely apart, not because you made a mistake, but because the world moved. For most of the 20th century, leadership ran on a simple promise. If you gathered enough information, built a solid strategy, and hired the right people to execute it, things would work out. And for a long time, they did. The environment was slow enough, predictable enough, that a well-drawn map could carry you from point A to point B with reasonable confidence. Companies like General Motors dominated for decades on exactly this model. Clear hierarchy, clear plans, clear lanes. The map matched the territory. Then the territory started shifting. Kodak had 145,000 employees in the late 1980s and a near monopoly on photographic film. They actually invented the digital camera in 1975. But their mental model, the map they had drawn of their own industry, told them that film was the business. So they held the map tightly, even as the terrain changed beneath them. By 2012, they were bankrupt. The problem wasn't a lack of intelligence or resources. The problem was that they kept consulting a map that no longer described the world they were standing in. This is what outdated mental models do. They don't feel like traps from the inside. They feel like experience. They feel like wisdom. A leader who has succeeded with a particular framework for 15 years doesn't see it as a limitation. They see it as proof. And that confidence, built on real past success, becomes the very thing that blinds them to present signals. Ronald Heifetz describes this as one of the central dangers in leadership, mistaking a technical solution for an adaptive problem. When the territory changes, the instinct is to work harder with the tools you already have. Draw a better map, run the process more efficiently, hire a smarter analyst. But sometimes the map itself is wrong, and no amount of refinement fixes that. What does letting go of the old map actually look like? It looks like Satya Nadella walking into Microsoft in 2014 and deciding that the company's identity as a Windows-first business was limiting its ability to think clearly about cloud computing. He didn't just change strategy, he changed the story Microsoft told itself about what it was. That shift, from a fixed mental model to an open one, preceded everything else that followed. The goal here is not to throw away structure. Plans still matter. Strategy still matters. But the adaptive leader holds a plan the way a scientist holds a hypothesis, seriously enough to act on it, and loosely enough to abandon it when the evidence says otherwise. Every plan becomes a bet, not a blueprint. And the moment you accept that, something useful happens. You stop defending the map, and you start paying attention to where you actually are. Part 2. Technical fixes versus real problems. Knowing the difference. Here's a truth that trips up even experienced leaders. Not every hard problem is the same kind of hard. Some problems are hard the way a locked door is hard. You need the right key, bring in the right consultant, apply the right software, redesign the right process, and the door opens. These are technical problems. They're often complex, sometimes expensive, and occasionally stressful, but they respond to expertise. A company's payroll system keeps crashing? That's a technical problem. Hire the right engineer. Done. But some problems are hard the way a bad marriage is hard. No consultant fixes that. No new tool closes the gap. What's actually needed is for someone, or everyone, to change how they see things, what they're willing to give up, or how they've been behaving for years. Ronald Heifetz at Harvard called these adaptive problems. And the distinction he drew in Leadership Without Easy Answers remains one of the most useful things ever written about leadership. The tragedy isn't that leaders can't tell the difference. It's that they often don't slow down long enough to try. A team that keeps missing deadlines gets a new project management tool. A culture stuck in silos gets a restructure. A product losing customers gets more features added to it. Each of these responses feels productive. Each one generates activity, meetings, and a sense of forward motion. And yet 6 months later, the same problems are back, often wearing slightly different clothes. Think about what happened at Nokia in the early 2000s. The company didn't lack technical capability. It had engineers, patents, resources, and market share most companies would trade anything to own. What it lacked was the willingness to challenge its own deeply held beliefs about what a phone was supposed to be. That was an adaptive problem. It required people to question assumptions they'd built entire careers on. No new process was going to fix that. What was needed was harder, honest conversation, the courage to name uncomfortable truths, and the willingness to grieve a model that had worked brilliantly before it stopped working entirely. So how do you tell which kind of problem you're dealing with? A useful starting question is this: does solving this require someone to change their mind, their values, or their behavior, or just their tools? If the answer involves changing minds, you're almost certainly in adaptive territory. Another signal is whether the problem keeps coming back despite repeated technical interventions. Recurring problems are often adaptive problems in disguise. The seductive pull of the technical fix is real because technical fixes feel like leadership. They produce visible results quickly. Adaptive work, by contrast, is slower, messier, and far less satisfying in the short term. It means sitting with discomfort, asking difficult questions, and resisting the urge to hand people an answer when what they actually need is the right question. That slower, more human kind of work is where the real change lives. Part 3. The danger of being the smartest person in the room. That slower, more human kind of work doesn't just demand patience. It demands something far more threatening to high-performing leaders: silence. Specifically, the silence of not being the one with the answer. Think about how most strong leaders got where they are. They were the person in every room who saw the solution fastest. They were promoted because they were reliably right. Their value was measurable in the quality of their answers. And for years, that worked. Then they reached a certain altitude, a level where problems became too complex, too human, and too layered for any one mind to hold. And the very thing that got them there started working against them. Liz Wiseman documented this pattern with striking clarity in her research on what she calls diminishers, leaders who, despite genuine intelligence and good intentions, consistently make the people around them less capable, not through cruelty, but through competence. Every time they jump in with the answer, they send a quiet but unmistakable signal: your thinking isn't needed here. Over time, teams stop thinking. They wait. They bring problems upward rather than solving them sideways. The organization becomes a single point of failure system, entirely dependent on one person's judgment at exactly the moment when distributed thinking is most needed. What makes this trap so hard to escape is that it feels like leadership. Answering quickly feels decisive. Solving the problem feels helpful. Steering the team feels responsible. The discomfort of asking a question and sitting with the silence that follows, that feels like wasting time. But consider what Alan Mulally did when he took over Ford in 2006. He inherited a company bleeding billions and staffed with executives who had perfected the art of looking competent in meetings. Rather than arriving with his own diagnosis and prescriptions, Mulally instituted a culture of honest questions, requiring leaders to bring real problems forward rather than polished ones. He asked more than he told. The effect was not immediate efficiency. It was something deeper. People started thinking again. Ford returned to profitability without a government bailout, while its competitors did not. The shift from answer giver to question asker is genuinely one of the hardest a capable leader will make. It requires tolerating the discomfort of watching someone struggle toward an answer you already have. It requires trusting that their slower path to the solution builds something yours never could: their own judgment, confidence, and ownership of the outcome. Heifetz and Linsky described this as getting off the dance floor and onto the balcony, creating enough distance from the action to see the system clearly, rather than just reacting within it. From the balcony, the smartest move is rarely to shout down the answer. It's to ask the question that helps people on the floor find their own footing. The most powerful thing an adaptive leader can carry into a room isn't the right answer. It's the right question, asked with genuine curiosity, at the moment when the team is just uncomfortable enough to think harder than they normally would. Part 4. What survival actually looks like in a VUCA world. So far in this chapter, we've talked about old maps, wrong tools, and the trap of being the smartest person in the room. But underneath all of that sits a bigger question. What does it actually feel like to lead when the world keeps shifting beneath your feet? That's where VUCA comes in, and not in the watered-down conference room version of it. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Most leadership conversations treat it as a fancy way of saying, things are tough right now. But each of those 4 words describes something specific happening to people and organizations, and they each demand a different response. Volatility is the speed of change. When things move fast, leaders tend to react rather than respond. There's a difference. Reacting is reflexive. It feels like action, but it's often just noise. Think of how many organizations completely restructured their teams in the first weeks of COVID-19, only to restructure again 3 months later when the picture became clearer. Speed triggered decisions that clarity would have tempered. Uncertainty is different. It erodes trust, slowly, quietly. When people don't know what's coming, they look to their leaders for signals. If those leaders perform confidence they don't actually have, people sense the gap. Brené Brown's research documented this repeatedly. Teams don't need leaders who pretend to have answers. They need leaders honest enough to say, I don't know yet, but here's how we're thinking about it. Complexity breaks something deeper. It breaks cause and effect thinking. Most strategies are built on the assumption that if you do A, B will follow. But in complex systems, that logic fails. Nick Obolensky's work on complex adaptive leadership shows that organizations, like ecosystems, don't respond to push-pull logic. You can't just pull one lever and predict the outcome. The system responds in ways that surprise even the people who designed it. Ambiguity, the 4th dimension, is perhaps the cruelest. It doesn't give you enough information to act with confidence, but it doesn't let you wait either. It paralyzes people who need clear direction before they move, and most people do. Ron Heifetz drew on evolutionary biology when he first described adaptive leadership, and the biological parallel is worth taking seriously. In nature, survival never means being the strongest or the fastest. It means being the most responsive to what the environment actually requires right now. Species that thrived through mass extinctions weren't the dominant ones. They were the ones that could shed what no longer worked and hold on to what still did. That's the real picture of survival in a VUCA world. It doesn't look like a leader who has everything under control. It looks like someone who can stay steady enough to think clearly when everything is loud, make a reasonable call with incomplete information, and be honest with their team about what they know and don't know. Not tougher, not smarter, just more willing to learn faster than the situation is changing. Chapter 2. Get off the dance floor. Part 1. Learning to watch before you act. The instinct to act fast feels like leadership. It looks decisive. It signals confidence. But it is often the most expensive mistake a leader can make. Ronald Heifetz uses a vivid image to describe what good leaders do differently. He asks you to picture a dance floor, loud, chaotic, full of movement. When you're on it, you can only see the people directly around you. You react to what's nearest. You miss the larger patterns. Getting to the balcony means stepping off the floor and watching the whole room from above. From up there, you can see who isn't dancing with whom. You can see where the crowd keeps getting stuck. You can see what the dancers themselves cannot. This is not about being passive. Watching is not the same as waiting. When Alan Mulally took over Ford in 2006, one of his first acts wasn't to slash budgets or restructure teams. It was to observe. He sat through meetings. He asked quiet questions. He watched which executives deflected, which ones were honest, and which ones dressed up bad news to look acceptable. Only after building that picture did he act. Ford became the only American automaker to avoid a government bailout. The observation came first. The cost of skipping this step is real and well documented. In her work on leadership Mindtraps, Jennifer Garvey-Berger describes how experienced leaders often act quickly not because the situation demands it, but because competence feels like knowing what to do immediately. The brain reaches for a familiar pattern and acts on it before the actual situation has been properly read. The result is a well-executed response to the wrong problem. Building observation into your daily practice starts with small, deliberate habits. Before you speak in a meeting, notice who has spoken and who hasn't. After a difficult conversation, sit for 3 minutes and write down what you actually heard versus what you assumed. Ask questions designed to open situations rather than confirm them. Not, "Why isn't this working?" but, "What are we not seeing yet?" These are not soft habits, they are diagnostic tools. Pay attention to what isn't said. Silence in a room carries information. When a team goes oddly quiet after a question, that quiet is data. When the same topic keeps getting deferred in meetings, that pattern is telling you something. Michael Watkins, in his research on leadership transitions, found that leaders who deliberately slowed their decision-making in the first weeks of a new role, specifically to gather sharper situational data, consistently outperformed those who moved quickly on early assumptions. The pause before the response is where real leadership work happens. Not in the reaction, but in the moment just before it, when you choose to look more carefully at what's actually in front of you. Part 2. The stories we tell ourselves and why they're usually wrong. That pause before the response, the one described in the last section, only works if what follows it is honest. And that's where most leaders quietly stumble. Because the pause doesn't guarantee clarity, it just creates space. What fills that space is almost always a story. Here's what happens in the brain the moment something goes wrong on a team. A project misses its deadline, a colleague goes quiet in a meeting, a new initiative gets half-hearted uptake. Within seconds, not minutes, seconds, the human mind produces an explanation. She's disengaged. He's threatened by the change. They just don't care enough. These explanations feel like observations. They feel factual. They are not. They are interpretations dressed up as facts, and they are doing enormous amounts of quiet damage inside organizations every single day. Jennifer Garvey-Berger calls these mind traps, default ways of making sense of the world that once served us well, but start to distort our perception in complex situations. The trap isn't stupidity, it's the opposite. Our pattern recognition is so fast and so efficient that it races ahead of our evidence, fills in the blanks, and hands us a finished story before we've even asked whether it's accurate. Think about what this looks like in practice. A team leader notices that 2 of her senior engineers are slow to adopt a new workflow system. Her immediate story: resistance. She starts managing them with more pressure, more check-ins, more urgency. What she hasn't asked, what her story didn't require her to ask, is why. It turns out one engineer has a disability that makes the new interface painful to use, and the other flagged a genuine security flaw in the system 3 weeks ago that nobody responded to. The story of resistance made both of those facts invisible. Chris Argyris, the Harvard organizational theorist, mapped this exact problem in what he called the ladder of inference. We observe a sliver of behavior. We assign meaning to it based on our existing beliefs. We draw conclusions from that meaning, and then we act on those conclusions as though they were based on the original observation. By the time we act, we are several rungs up a ladder that we built ourselves, operating on an interpretation that has quietly become indistinguishable from fact. The discipline that changes this is deceptively simple. Separate what you saw from what you think it means, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a daily leadership habit. When you catch yourself thinking, "This team can't handle change," stop and ask, "What did I actually observe? What specific behavior, word, or event prompted that conclusion?" You will often find that the observation is narrow and the story is enormous. Brené Brown's research at the University of Houston produced a phrase that captures this well: the story I'm telling myself. She encouraged leaders to name their narrative out loud, which does something powerful. It creates distance between you and the interpretation, making it easier to examine and easier to revise. Leaders who practice this reported having fewer misread conflicts and more productive conversations, precisely because naming the story made them less certain it was true. The goal isn't to have no stories. You cannot lead without making sense of what's in front of you. The goal is to hold your stories loosely, as working hypotheses rather than verdicts, and to stay genuinely open to the moment when the evidence contradicts what you assumed. Part 3. Reading the room: patterns, people, and pressure. That shift from holding your stories loosely to reading the room accurately is not just a mindset change. It is a skill, and like most real skills, it takes practice to see what most people walk right past. Think of an experienced doctor doing rounds. They are not just listening to what a patient says. They are watching how the patient moves, noticing what the patient avoids saying, picking up on the tension in the room when a family member is present. The words are just one layer. The good diagnostician reads all three simultaneously: what is being said, how it is being said, and what cannot seem to get said at all. Adaptive leaders work exactly the same way. Every group has a hidden architecture. There is the official structure, the org chart, the job titles, the reporting lines, and then there is the real one. The colleague everyone defers to before a big decision, even though she holds no formal authority. The team veteran whose silent disapproval in a meeting kills momentum faster than any executive veto. The historical rift between two departments that nobody mentions but everyone designs around. These invisible structures shape outcomes daily, and most leaders never bother to map them. Heifetz and Linsky describe this as reading the systemic forces beneath the surface, the loyalties, fears, and competing interests that determine what a group can and cannot do at any given moment. When Jeff Immelt took over GE from Jack Welch in 2001, he inherited not just a company, but an entire emotional mythology. Welch had become a near mythological figure inside GE, and that shadow shaped what people were willing to say, challenge, or even think in front of leadership. Immelt had to read that dynamic with precision before he could begin to move anything. Pressure is one of the most honest diagnostic tools available to a leader. When a team is under stress, facing a missed target, a public failure, a leadership change, the unspoken rules tend to surface. Who goes quiet? Who dominates? Who looks to whom before speaking? These moments are not inconveniences to manage, they are windows. A leader paying close attention during a crisis learns more about a group's true power structure and emotional wiring in 1 week than in 6 months of routine operation. Resistance deserves particular attention here. The instinct is to read resistance as a problem, someone being difficult, change-averse, or obstructive. But resistance almost always carries information. A team resisting a new process may be protecting something genuinely valuable that the process threatens to destroy. A manager pushing back on a strategy may be the only person close enough to the ground to see what senior leadership cannot. Jennifer Garvey Berger would call this a mind trap, the reflex to suppress resistance rather than get curious about what it is trying to say. The most important signals in any organization are rarely the loudest ones. They are the hesitation before an answer, the glance exchanged across a table, the topic that gets raised and then quickly dropped. Learning to catch those signals is not about being suspicious. It is about paying the kind of attention that turns information into genuine understanding. Part 4. When to stay still and when to move. Those quiet signals you learned to catch in the last section, the hesitation, the dropped topic, the glance across the table, are only useful if you know what to do with them next. And here is where most leaders stumble. They see the signal, feel the pull to act, and move fast, because moving feels like leading. Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky documented this pattern across hundreds of leadership cases. Leaders under pressure almost universally speed up. They call more meetings, issue clearer directives, push harder for decisions. The urgency feels productive. It rarely is. What they are actually doing is outrunning the readiness of the people around them. Think of it like a doctor who diagnoses a patient correctly but prescribes treatment before the patient has accepted the diagnosis. The medicine is right, the timing is wrong. The patient either ignores the prescription or resists it entirely, not because they are difficult, but because they were not ready. Timing in leadership works the same way. The same conversation, the same challenge, the same honest feedback can land completely differently depending on when it arrives. Delivered into a moment of openness, it shifts things. Delivered into defensiveness or exhaustion, it hardens resistance and closes doors that were just beginning to open. The discipline Heifetz calls regulating the heat is exactly this. Productive tension, the kind that creates focus and energy, lives in a specific range. Too little pressure and people stay comfortable, avoiding the work that actually needs doing. Too much and the system shuts down. People stop thinking clearly. They go into protection mode. Your job as a leader is not to eliminate the heat, but to keep it in the range where real work becomes possible. What makes this difficult is that the pressure to act is almost always louder than the signal to wait. A startup founder watching a product launch stall feels it. A manager whose team is struggling through a restructure feels it. The silence between actions feels like failure. But some of the most consequential leadership moves are acts of restraint, choosing not to speak when you could, not to rescue when someone is struggling, not to decide when the group has not yet earned their own answer. Amazon's early approach to long-form decision memos, where leaders were required to sit in silence and read before any discussion began, was essentially a forced act of collective pacing. It slowed the room down deliberately so that thinking could catch up with the urgency everyone brought through the door. The question worth carrying into every high-pressure moment is not simply, "What should I do?" It is, "What can this group actually absorb right now?" That shift from your readiness to their readiness is where adaptive timing lives. And occasionally, the most honest answer to that question is, "Not yet. Do nothing. Watch what emerges." That is not passivity. Done consciously and with full attention, it is some of the hardest and most precise leadership work there is. Chapter 3. The brave thing is usually the uncomfortable thing. Part 1. Why change always asks someone to give something up. Most change initiatives fail, not because the plan was wrong, but because nobody admitted what the plan would cost people personally. Think about what happens when a company shifts from a top-down decision-making structure to a more collaborative one. On paper, it sounds positive. More voices, more input, faster innovation. But look at what actually disappears. The senior manager who spent 20 years being the person people came to for answers suddenly has less of a reason to be in the room. The expert who built their reputation on knowing more than everyone else now has to sit in a circle and listen. That is not a small thing. That is an identity being quietly dismantled while someone shows enthusiasm-filled slides about the exciting journey ahead. Ronald Heifetz put it plainly. Resistance to change is almost never irrational. It is a rational response to a real loss. When IBM pivoted from hardware to services in the 1990s, the engineers who had spent their careers building physical machines were not being difficult when they pushed back. They were grieving the relevance of everything they had learned. When Kodak kept betting on film long after digital cameras arrived, it was not stupidity driving those decisions. It was the unbearable prospect of admitting that 3 decades of institutional knowledge had suddenly stopped mattering. The trouble is that most change management plans are built around addition. New systems, new training, new language on the company values wall. What they rarely include is a clear-eyed accounting of what gets taken away. And so people feel the loss, cannot name it in the formal process, and express it instead as cynicism, slowdown, or quiet defection. Your job as a leader is not to sell change with enough enthusiasm that the grief gets buried. It is to name the loss out loud before someone else does it behind your back. When a hospital system in the UK moved to electronic patient records, the implementation team that struggled most was the one whose project lead kept talking about efficiency gains. The team that adapted fastest had a leader who opened the first meeting by saying, "Some of you have spent years developing a system that works. We are asking you to start over. That is hard, and it is fair to feel that." The room changed. People did not suddenly love the new system. They just stopped pretending they didn't mind losing the old one. This is what genuine leadership in a change process looks like. Not cheerleading, not glossing, but standing in front of people and acknowledging with specificity what this change is asking them to let go of: their comfort, their status, their expertise, their identity, before asking them to move toward anything new. Part 2. Holding steady when people want you to have all the answers. People do not actually want certainty. What they want is to feel safe enough to keep working. These two things sound the same, but they are not, and confusing them is where a lot of leaders go wrong. When a crisis hits, a merger, a restructure, a market shift, people turn to whoever's in charge and ask, sometimes with words, and sometimes just with their eyes, "Do you know what's going to happen?" The tempting answer is yes. It feels kind. It feels like leadership. But a leader who manufactures confidence they do not have is not protecting their team. They are borrowing time against a debt that always comes due. Ronald Heifetz calls this holding the container. Think of it like a pressure cooker. The job of the pot is not to remove the heat. The job is to hold the pressure steady, firm enough that the contents do not explode, but not so sealed that nothing can cook. A leader who pretends everything is fine removes the pressure entirely. A leader who panics lets the lid blow off. The skill is in holding the container, keeping enough structure and calm in place that people can stay with a hard problem instead of running from it. What that looks like practically is less dramatic than people expect. It sounds like, "I don't have the full answer yet, but here is what I do know, here is what we are watching, and here is when I will come back to you." That sentence alone, said with genuine steadiness, not performed bravado, does more for a team than 100 confident-sounding predictions that later turn out to be wrong. Jacinda Ardern demonstrated this during the early weeks of COVID-19 in New Zealand. She did not pretend to know how long it would last. She communicated clearly, frequently, and honestly, telling people what was known, what was not, and what the government was doing in the meantime. Trust did not require certainty. It required consistency and honesty about the limits of what anyone could know. The harder question is what happens inside the leader themselves, because tolerating not knowing is genuinely uncomfortable. Jennifer Garvey Berger's research on leadership development shows that one of the most common mental traps leaders fall into is the need to have a clear answer, not because the situation demands it, but because they cannot sit with the discomfort of not having one. When that happens, leaders close down conversations too early, push for decisions before the real problem is understood, and mistake the relief of a resolution for the wisdom of a good one. The leaders who hold steady in uncertainty are not the ones who feel no pressure. They are the ones who have learned, usually through difficulty, that not knowing is not failure. It is just the first honest step toward figuring something out together. Part 3. Vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the price of trust. There's a particular moment most leaders remember, the first time they admitted in front of their team that they had got something wrong. The stomach drops, the silence feels enormous, and then, almost always, something unexpected happens. People lean in. For decades, the unspoken contract of leadership was simple. You pretend to know more than you do, and people pretend to believe you. It worked well enough when problems were predictable and solutions were already known. But adaptive challenges, by definition, do not come with known solutions. They require everyone in the room to think honestly, including the person at the front of it. Brené Brown spent years studying what actually builds trust in teams. Her finding is almost embarrassingly simple. People trust leaders who are honest about what they do not know. Not leaders who perform confidence, but leaders who treat honesty as a form of respect. When a leader says, "I'm not sure this strategy is working. What are you seeing?" they are not admitting failure. They are signaling that the truth matters more than appearances. That signal travels fast through a team. The reverse is equally true. A leader who never shows doubt creates a team culture built on the same performance. People learn quickly what is safe to say. If admitting uncertainty is career risk, people will stop admitting it. The mistakes that could have been caught early get quietly buried instead. Howard Schultz, during Starbucks' public struggles in 2008, stood in front of employees and partners and named the company's failures plainly, including his own decisions that contributed to them. The recovery that followed was not despite that honesty, it was built on it. What trips most leaders up is confusing vulnerability with oversharing or emotional performance. Real vulnerability in leadership is much quieter than that. It is saying, "I don't have the full picture yet," before a strategy meeting. It is acknowledging that a restructure hurt people, even if it was the right call. It is asking, "What do you think?" and actually pausing long enough to hear the answer. These are small moments, but they compound. Keegan and Leahy's research into what they call deliberately developmental organizations found that the teams with the highest adaptive capacity were the ones where people felt safe enough to surface their real thinking, not their polished, upward-managed version of it. That safety does not come from a values poster. It comes from watching the leader be honest first, repeatedly, until the pattern becomes the culture. Trust is not declared. It is demonstrated, one uncomfortable, honest moment at a time. Part 4. Small experiments beat big bets in uncertain times. That shift from vulnerability to experimentation is not accidental. When a leader has built genuine trust by admitting what they do not know, the next natural move is to act on that honesty, not by pretending to have a grand plan, but by running small, honest tests to find out what actually works. Most organizations, when facing uncertainty, do one of two things. They either freeze, waiting for more information before committing, or they overcommit, placing a massive bet on a strategy that felt logical in the boardroom, but has never actually been tested against reality. Both responses share the same flawed assumption, that certainty is a prerequisite for action. It is not. Eric Ries built the entire lean startup methodology on this single idea. Rather than spending 2 years building a product in secret and launching it with fanfare, companies like Dropbox used a 2-minute explainer video to test whether people even wanted the product before a single line of production code was written. The video got 75,000 signups overnight. That was the experiment. A learning cost almost nothing. The alternative, building the full product first and discovering the same thing after 2 years, would have cost millions. The same logic applies directly to leadership decisions. Say you want to introduce a new feedback culture across your organization. The instinct is to roll it out company-wide, hire a consultant, run workshops, and announce the new era. But what if you treated it as a hypothesis first? Pick one team, run it for 60 days, define in advance what would tell you it is working and what would tell you it is not. That is not timidity, that is intelligence. Heifetz would describe this as reducing the heat to a productive level. Big, irreversible bets spike the temperature inside an organization. They create anxiety, resistance, and political maneuvering because the stakes feel existential. Small experiments keep the temperature manageable. Enough pressure to generate genuine learning, not so much that the system shuts down defensively. The hardest part is reframing what failure means. When Amazon launched its Fire Phone in 2014, it was a costly failure by any measure. But Jeff Bezos openly credited that failure with producing the knowledge and team capability that later built the Amazon Echo. The experiment failed. The learning did not. That distinction matters enormously for leaders, because teams watch how you respond to failed experiments far more closely than they watch your successes. If a pilot program falls short and the leader treats it as a disaster, the message lands: do not try anything you are not already sure will work. And in uncertain times, that message is fatal. Treat every initiative as a hypothesis. State clearly what you are testing, what result would confirm it, and what result would change your direction. Then run the smallest version of it you can. You are not looking for proof. You are looking for signal. Chapter 4. The Team That Bends Together. Part 1. Stop being the answer machine. Start being the question asker. Think about the last time someone on your team walked into your office with a problem. What did you do? If you're like most leaders, you answered it. Quickly, efficiently, and with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has seen this problem before and knows exactly how to fix it. It felt productive. It probably felt like leadership. And it was, slowly making your team weaker. This is what Ronald Heifetz calls one of the most seductive traps in leadership: the instinct to treat every challenge as a technical problem with a known solution, one that the leader at the top is best placed to provide. The team learns the pattern fast. Bring problems up, receive answers back. Over time, they stop thinking through the hard stuff themselves. Why would they? The machine is right upstairs. Edgar Schein, the MIT organizational psychologist, spent decades studying how teams behave under pressure. He found something uncomfortable. In organizations where leaders consistently provide answers, people stop developing judgment. Not because they are lazy, but because judgment, like a muscle, only grows when it is actually used. When the leader short-circuits that process, the muscle never gets the workout. The shift away from answer giving is not about withholding help. It is about asking questions that make the person in front of you do the thinking they are actually capable of. There is a difference between asking, "Did you try option B?" which is just a veiled answer, and asking, "What have you already ruled out and why?" The second question puts the weight of reasoning back where it belongs. Satya Nadella's Transformation of Microsoft offers one of the clearest real-world illustrations of this principle at scale. When he took over in 2014, he inherited a culture described by former employees as a place where appearing to know the answer mattered more than finding the right one. Nadella shifted his leadership style explicitly toward curiosity. He asked questions in executive meetings instead of pronouncing verdicts. He talked openly about what he did not know. The culture started to move. Microsoft's market value grew from around $300 billion to over $2 trillion in the decade that followed. Curiosity was not incidental to that. It was structural. The questions worth asking are ones that open rather than close. What do you think the real problem is? Rather than, here is what the real problem is. What would you do if I were not available? Rather than solving it for them right now. Jennifer Garvey Berger describes these as questions that stretch a person's thinking to its edges, not to be difficult, but because that is where genuine growth happens. The silence after a good question, when someone is actually thinking, feels excruciating to leaders wired for pace. But that pause is not a problem. That pause is the work. Part 2. Diversity isn't a value. It's a survival strategy. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. When was the last time someone in your team told you something you genuinely did not want to hear? Most leaders say they want diverse teams. They write it into company values, mention it in all-hands meetings, and nod enthusiastically when consultants bring it up. But there is a significant difference between wanting diversity and actually building a team that thinks differently enough to matter. The first is a preference. The second requires tolerating real discomfort on a regular basis. Here is the plain truth. When a team is made up of people with similar backgrounds, similar training, and similar ways of seeing the world, decisions come quickly and conversations feel smooth. There is very little friction, but that smoothness is a warning sign, not a feature. It means nobody in the room is seeing what the others cannot see. The blind spots are shared, invisible, and potentially enormous. Scott Page, a complexity researcher at the University of Michigan, spent years modeling how different types of teams solve hard problems. His findings were counterintuitive. Teams made up of people with diverse thinking styles consistently outperform teams of individually smarter people who thought alike. Not sometimes, consistently. The friction that diversity introduces is not a bug in the system. It is the mechanism that makes the system work. NASA learned this the hardest possible way. Before the Challenger disaster in 1986, engineers at Morton Thiokol had raised serious concerns about the O-ring seals in cold temperatures. But the culture of the decision-making group discouraged dissent. People who disagreed with the dominant view were sidelined or pressured into silence. The team reached consensus, but it was the wrong consensus. What was missing was not data. It was an environment where the person seeing things differently was treated as the most important voice in the room, not the most inconvenient one. Heifetz calls this kind of pressure the heat of the moment, the instinct within groups to suppress discomfort and converge on agreement when the stakes feel high. The problem is that high stakes are exactly when you most need someone to push back. The leader's job here is specific. It is not simply to hire people who look different. It is to create conditions where genuinely different thinking is sought and protected. That means asking the quietest person in the room what they think. It means rewarding the person who spots the flaw in a plan, rather than ignoring them to keep momentum going. It means treating disagreement not as a sign of dysfunction, but as a sign that the team is doing its job. Diverse teams are harder to manage. Consensus takes longer. But when things change fast, and they will, a team full of people who can only see one version of reality is one of the most fragile things you can build. Part 3. Building people who grow, not just perform. Most teams are built to deliver. Hit the target, meet the deadline, repeat. And for a while, that works. But when the environment shifts, when the strategy needs updating, when new problems emerge that no one has solved before, a team optimized only for execution tends to freeze. The reason isn't lack of talent. It's that no one ever built the muscle for growth. Robert Kagan and Lisa Laskow-Leahy spent years studying organizations that took a different approach. In their research on what they called deliberately developmental organizations, they found companies like Bridgewater Associates and NextJump that made a striking commitment that helping people grow wasn't a side project, it was the actual work. At NextJump, struggling employees weren't let go, they were coached. The belief was that the discomfort of growth, not the comfort of performance, was what made the organization stronger over time. The difference between a team that performs and a team that grows often comes down to what happens after something goes wrong. In a performance culture, mistakes get swept past. There's another quarter to hit, another deadline to chase. In a growth culture, a mistake is material, something to sit with, examine, and learn from. Carol Dweck's research on mindset showed clearly that people who believe their abilities can develop through effort are not just more resilient, they're more capable over time. The leader's job is to build the conditions where that belief becomes the norm. What does that actually look like on a Tuesday afternoon? It looks like a one-on-one where you ask someone not just what they delivered this week, but what they found hard and what they learned from it. It looks like assigning a project slightly beyond someone's current skill level. Not so far that it breaks them, but far enough that they have to stretch. It looks like responding to a failed attempt with curiosity instead of correction. What would you do differently, rather than, here's what you did wrong? Psychological safety is not a feel-good bonus. Amy Edmondson's research at Harvard showed that teams where people felt safe to speak up, admit errors, and challenge assumptions consistently outperformed teams where they didn't, even when those quieter teams appeared smoother from the outside. The smoothness was a warning sign, not a measure of health. The hardest part of building a growth culture is that it requires you to tolerate visible inefficiency in the short term. Watching someone figure out something you already know takes patience. Letting a person work through a mistake instead of fixing it for them takes restraint. But every time you resist the urge to jump in with the answer, every time you ask instead of tell, you are doing something more valuable than solving the immediate problem. You are building a person who can solve the next one without you. Part 4. How trust turns a group into something that can actually adapt. That growth you're building in individuals, though, only compounds when the people around them feel safe enough to actually use what they're developing. And that safety has a name: trust. Here is a simple way to think about it. Imagine two teams. Both have smart, capable people. Team A has members who nod in meetings, keep concerns to themselves, and avoid disagreeing with the boss. Team B has members who surface problems early, challenge each other's thinking, and admit when they've made a mistake. When conditions shift and pressure arrives, Team A freezes. Nobody wants to be the person who got it wrong. Team B moves. Because they've already practiced honesty in the small moments, they can handle honesty in the big ones. Patrick Lencioni, in The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, identified the absence of trust as the first and most foundational crack in team performance. His point was sharp. You cannot have productive conflict without trust. You cannot have commitment without productive conflict. Pull out the bottom brick, trust, and the whole structure collapses. This maps directly onto what adaptive leadership demands. A team that can't disagree openly is a team that can't process new information. And a team that can't process new information cannot adapt. What makes this harder is that trust is not built in a single event. No offsite, no team dinner, no well-intentioned workshop creates it. Trust is the accumulated weight of small, consistent moments. The leader who said they'd follow up and actually did. The colleague who told you your idea had a flaw before you walked into the boardroom with it. The team that had a genuine argument on a Tuesday and still had lunch together on Wednesday. Brené Brown's research reinforces this. What generates trust is not grand gestures, but what she calls marble jar moments, small deposits made over time, each one adding a little more to the account. The danger is that trust is destroyed far faster than it is built. One public humiliation, one betrayal of a confidence, one leader who takes credit when things go well and distributes blame when they don't. These aren't dramatic events, they're ordinary lapses, the kind that happen in organizations every day. And each one makes people quietly decide to protect themselves, to share less, to take fewer risks. When that happens, the team stops being a team in any meaningful sense. It becomes a group of individuals managing their own exposure. For leaders, this means that the daily, unremarkable behavior is actually the work. How you respond when someone admits a mistake signals everything about whether honesty is genuinely safe here. How you handle disagreement in a meeting tells every quiet observer in the room whether it's worth speaking up next time. Adaptive teams are not built through strategy. They are built through the accumulated evidence that this is a place where the truth can be told. Chapter 5. Water Always Finds a Way. Part 1. Your why is the anchor when everything else moves. Think about the last time you made a decision under real pressure. What did you reach for? Most leaders, if they're honest, reach for urgency. They ask, what does the situation demand right now? But the leaders who tend to make the best calls in chaos ask a different question. What am I actually here for? That single shift in orientation changes everything. Purpose sounds like a soft concept. It lives on office walls, inside annual reports, and gets read aloud at company retreats before everyone goes back to their desks and forgets it. But that's not the kind of purpose we're talking about. We're talking about something more personal and more stubborn. The reason you do this work. The thing that makes a hard conversation worth having. The invisible line you won't cross, even when crossing it would be easier. That's your anchor. Simon Sinek's work on why became famous because it explained how brands communicate. But the more important application has nothing to do with marketing. It's about what happens inside a leader's head at 2 in the morning when the strategy is falling apart. Leaders who know their why don't panic the same way. They still feel the pressure, but they have a reference point that sits outside the chaos. They know what they're protecting, which means they know what they're willing to sacrifice. And that distinction alone is worth more than any crisis management framework. Howard Schultz demonstrated this at Starbucks. When he returned as CEO in 2008 during the brand's decline, he didn't start by cutting costs or reorganizing structure. He started by going back to purpose, the idea that Starbucks existed to create human connection through a shared experience. That clarity shaped every trade-off that followed, including the controversial decision to close over 7,000 stores for a single afternoon to retrain baristas. The move cost millions. It also signaled, internally and externally, what the company was actually for. Ask yourself, if your role, your title, and your team were stripped away tomorrow, What would you still believe about why good leadership matters? Whatever survives that question is closer to your real why than anything on your organization's values poster. The reason this matters for adaptive leadership specifically is that change constantly pressures leaders to compromise on quality, on people, on the time needed to do things properly. Without a clear sense of purpose, every trade-off is made in the fog of immediate pressure. With it, you have a standard against which to measure every decision, even the ones that have no good options. Purpose doesn't make hard choices easy, it makes them clear. And in conditions of constant change, it gives leaders a guidance that no temporary crisis can shake. Clarity is the rarest and most valuable thing a leader can offer, both to themselves and to the people looking to them for direction. Part 2. The mind traps that keep good leaders stuck. Clarity of purpose, as we explored, gives a leader direction. But here is the uncomfortable truth that follows. Even the most purpose-driven leaders can be completely undermined by the way their own minds work. Not by a lack of effort, not by a shortage of experience, and not by bad intentions. Just by thinking in patterns that have quietly outlived their usefulness. Jennifer Garvey Berger, whose work on adult development has shaped how we understand leadership growth, calls these patterns mind traps. Think of them as mental shortcuts that were built during a time when they worked brilliantly and are now running on autopilot long after the conditions changed. The trap isn't stupidity, it's familiarity. These habits feel like good judgment precisely because they've produced results before. The first and perhaps most seductive mind trap is the hunger for a simple story. When a problem gets complicated, something in the human brain reaches hard for a clean explanation. A product fails, and the leader decides it was the wrong market. A team underperforms, and the leader decides it was a hiring mistake. Both might be partially true. But complex problems rarely have single causes, and the leader who insists on one is already working with a distorted map. Heifetz would recognize this immediately as the urge to treat an adaptive challenge like a technical one. Apply a known solution, restore the familiar, move on. Then there's the trap of perspective blindness, the quiet assumption that what you see is what is actually there. A leader who came up through finance reads every organizational problem through a financial lens. A leader who built their career on discipline and process tends to see chaos where others see creative flexibility. This isn't bias in the dramatic sense. It's just the predictable result of a brain that uses past experience to interpret present situations. The problem is that it can make a leader completely invisible to evidence that doesn't fit the frame they're already holding. Closely related is binary thinking. This or that, strong or weak, committed or not. Real situations almost never sort that cleanly. A team member who pushes back on a decision isn't disloyal. They might be the most engaged person in the room. A strategy that isn't working perfectly isn't necessarily wrong. The moment a leader collapses nuance into either or, they've lost access to the most useful part of the information available to them. The final mind trap is perhaps the hardest to see in yourself. The grip of control. Some leaders manage so tightly, answer so quickly, and solve so consistently that the people around them never develop real judgment. Robert Keegan's research on developmental organizations makes this painfully clear. When leaders treat their teams as problems to be managed rather than thinkers to be grown, the organization's adaptive capacity quietly shrinks with every passing year. None of this makes a leader bad. It makes them human. The only move that matters is learning to see these patterns while they're happening. Not in hindsight, not in someone else, but in yourself, in the middle of a real situation. That kind of awareness isn't a one-time insight. It's a daily practice, and it starts the moment you stop trusting your instincts quite so unconditionally. Part 3. Adapting without losing yourself. That awareness of your own mental patterns, hard as it is to build, only matters if it is paired with something equally difficult. Knowing who you are when the pressure to change comes not from outside challenge, but from inside expectation. There is a particular kind of identity crisis that hits experienced leaders in moments of real disruption. It does not look like a breakdown. It looks like overcompensation. The decisive leader suddenly starts running every decision through endless consultation, not because collaboration is wrong, but because they've been told they're too controlling. The expert leader starts deferring on everything, not out of humility, but out of fear of being seen as rigid. They are changing, but they are changing reactively in response to feedback and pressure, without any internal compass telling them what to keep and what to let go. That is not adaptation. That is self-erasure dressed up as growth. Brené Brown makes a point about this in Dare to Lead that tends to land quietly but hit hard later. Leaders who lack a clear sense of their own values tend to become what she calls armored, performing what they think leadership should look like rather than actually leading. The armor changes shape depending on the room, but there is nothing solid underneath it. When circumstances shift, those leaders don't adapt. They just change costumes. Real adaptation requires a distinction that most leadership development programs skip over entirely: the difference between your style and yourself. Your style, how direct you are, how much you plan, how visible you make yourself, how you run a meeting, can and should shift depending on what a situation demands. Yourself, what you believe is right, how you treat people when things are hard, what you refuse to compromise even when it is costly, that is the anchor. Change your style freely. Guard yourself carefully. Howard Schultz demonstrated this at Starbucks when he returned as CEO in 2008. He made dramatic changes, closed thousands of stores, restructured operations, redesigned the customer experience. Everything about his strategy shifted, but his stated conviction that the company existed to serve people with dignity stayed exactly where it had always been. He adapted everything around a fixed center. That is the pattern worth studying. The honest question every leader needs to sit with is this: when you changed recently, did you change because you reflected and chose to, or because someone made you feel you had to? The first kind of change builds you. The second kind slowly hollows you out, even when the change itself looks sensible from the outside. Growth and self-betrayal can look identical from a distance. The difference is felt from the inside, and only you know which one is happening. Part 4. One small shift you can make today. That question, what is the one thing I could actually do differently this week, is deceptively simple. Most leaders read it, nod, and then reach for something big: a new communication strategy, a restructured one-to-one format, a team offsite. But the research on behavior change is clear. The smaller the first action, the more likely it sticks. B.J. Fogg at Stanford spent years studying this, and his conclusion was blunt. We fail at change not because we lack motivation, but because we start too large. So think small, genuinely small. In our next meeting, try asking one question where you would normally have given an answer. Not a rhetorical question, a real one. What do you think we should do here? And then staying quiet long enough for the other person to actually think. Ronald Heifetz calls this giving the work back, returning the problem to the people who need to develop the capacity to solve it. It feels uncomfortable the first time. That discomfort is the point. Or try something quieter still. If your team has been through a change recently, a restructure, a departure, a shift in direction, name it, not in a grand speech, but in a brief, honest moment. I know this has been a strange few months. I think we've all lost something, even if we haven't said it out loud. Brené Brown documented in her research that teams who feel seen move faster and trust more readily. Acknowledgement is not weakness. It turns out to be one of the most practical things a leader can do. These small moves matter because leadership at its core is a series of moments, not a strategy, not a personality, moments, and the choices made inside them. Nelson Mandela did not transform South Africa with one speech. He transformed it with 27 years of daily choices about who he was going to be, and then a series of specific, considered moves that followed. You don't need a bigger framework. You need to pick one moment this week and choose differently inside it. Ask instead of answer. Acknowledge instead of move on. Hand back instead of solve. That is where it begins, not in knowing more, but in doing one small thing with more honesty and intention than you did it yesterday. The world has enough leaders with impressive strategies and crowded bookshelves. What it needs are leaders willing to act on what they already know, starting now, starting small, starting true.